The sound of pickaxes striking stone echoed through the dark tunnels of the Laurion silver mine, a rhythmic, relentless pounding that seemed to vibrate the very earth beneath them. The narrow passageways twisted and turned like veins in a body, the walls rough and jagged, the air thick with dust and the stench of sweat. It was a world where the light of the sun never reached, where only the flicker of a lantern or torch lit the way. Beneath the earth, everything was muted, suffocating, except for the heavy, oppressive presence of the overseers. Theodoros stood at the edge of the mine shaft, his shoulders aching from the weight of the pickaxe he gripped tightly in his calloused hands. The sweat dripped down his face, but he did not wipe it away. He did not pause. He had learned long ago that to stop, to show any sign of weakness, was to invite punishment. And the overseers were always watching. It was the way of life in Laurion, a brutal, unrelenting existence where the enslaved worked tirelessly, digging for silver that would never be theirs. They labored day in and day out under the cruel gaze of their masters, their only reward the promise of another day of suffering. And at the head of it all was Niketas, the overseer who ruled the mine with an iron fist, whose sadistic tendencies made even the hardened workers flinch at his presence. Tonight, though, something was different. Theodoros could feel it. There was a stirring in his chest, a cold, growing fire that had been kindling for years, fed by the constant brutality he had endured. Tonight, it would finally come to a head. Before we descend deeper into this world of darkness, oppression, and the desperate hunger for freedom, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? Drop a comment below, and if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been hidden beneath the earth, buried for generations. Laurion was known for its rich silver deposits, but for Theodoros, it was a place of endless suffering. The mine, a vast labyrinth of tunnels and shafts, was both his prison and his workplace. Theodoros had been brought here as a boy, torn from his family and sold to the mine's owners. For as long as he could remember, he had worked the mines, laboring under the cruel oversight of Niketas and his men, whose faces were always twisted with disdain, whose hands were always ready to strike. The mine was a place where time lost meaning. Days and nights blurred together, a haze of exhaustion and pain. The only real difference was the change in shifts, morning, afternoon, and night, when the enslaved workers would swap places, their faces grim and hollow, their bodies aching. Every day was the same. The overseers would bark orders, whip anyone who faltered, and beat anyone who dared show even a hint of defiance. And yet, over the years, Theodoros had learned something the overseers never suspected. He had learned the mine, the tunnels, the passageways, the layout of the land. He knew the geography of the place better than any overseer, better than anyone else who worked there. The miners were like rats in a maze, driven by hunger, exhaustion, and fear. But Theodoros was different. He had spent years plotting his escape, his rebellion, in the darkest corners of his mind. Each day, he listened closely to the overseers' commands, to their movements, and to the sounds of the mine. He memorized their routines, their patterns, when they were drunk, when they were distracted, when they would be most vulnerable. He knew exactly when to strike. He had waited long enough. But for now, he remained silent. He worked without complaint, his hands raw from the pickaxe and the weight of the labor. His thoughts were a quiet storm in the back of his mind, growing stronger with each passing hour. His mind, sharp and calculating, was already moving ahead, planning every detail of what would come. It was during one of these quiet moments, while the rest of the workers were focused on their tasks, that Theodoros heard the familiar sound of Niketas's boots echoing through the tunnel. The overseer was making his rounds, his shadow falling over the workers like a dark cloud. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by cruelty. He had no mercy for the slaves beneath him. To him, they were nothing more than tools to extract silver from the earth. Theodoros did not flinch. He had seen this man's face 1,000 times. He had heard his insults, felt the lash of his whip, and endured the humiliation of being treated like an animal. But tonight, as Niketas approached, Theodoros's hands tightened around the pickaxe, and for the first time in years, He felt something stir within him. It was a feeling he had not known before, something powerful, something dark, but something that felt right. Niketas stopped in front of Theodoros, his eyes narrowing. "You," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Still here, working like a dog? You're a disgrace." Theodoros didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew Niketas was trying to provoke him, to test him. But Theodoros had learned not to show his anger, not to give in to the provocation. His silence was his power. His patience was his weapon. Niketas stepped closer, his breath sour with the stench of liquor. "You think you're better than this, don't you?" he sneered. "You think you deserve more than this? You're nothing. Just like the rest of them. No better than the dirt beneath your feet." Theodoros's heart began to pound, but he did not respond. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he held it back. Not yet. Not now. Niketas's eyes gleamed with malice. "You'll never be free, slave. This is your life. You'll die in these tunnels, just like the rest of them." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Theodoros's grip tightened around the pickaxe, the metal cold against his palm. He could feel the weight of his past, the years of pain and suffering, all converging into this moment. He was done. He was done being silent, done being patient. Tonight, he would take his revenge. "Not today," Theodoros said quietly. The words almost a whisper, but they carried with them the weight of everything he had endured. Niketas smirked, assuming it was another meek slave's attempt to resist. He didn't realize how deeply his words had cut. He didn't understand that with each strike, with each insult, he was forging Theodoros's resolve. As the overseer moved on, satisfied with the power he had exerted, Theodoros watched him leave, his mind already turning, calculating. The time had come. Theodoros's hands trembled slightly as he worked, though the cause of his unease had nothing to do with the physical exertion. It was the gnawing, insidious thoughts that plagued him. Thoughts of the overseers and their cruelty, of Niketas's smirk, the whip that always hung above him, and the fact that nothing ever changed. Day after day, the same relentless rhythm, the same smoldering anger simmering within him. Niketas's words still echoed in his mind. "You'll die in these tunnels, just like the rest of them." Theodoros paused in his work for a moment and looked around the dark tunnel. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and sweat, and the walls seemed to press in on him as if they were closing in, suffocating him. The weight of the pickaxe in his hand was suddenly too much to bear, but the weight of his rage felt heavier. He had been patient. For years, he had buried his anger deep within, waiting for the right moment, for something, anything, to give him the chance to strike back. But every day he spent in the mine, every hour spent under the lash of an overseer, that moment seemed to slip further and further away, until tonight. The final straw came when they executed an act of cruelty that shook him to his core. They had taken one of his fellow miners, a man named Cleon, and beaten him senseless for the crime of speaking out of turn. Cleon had been a quiet man, a gentle soul who had never resisted or caused trouble. He had been a father, a husband. His crime? A simple protest after another brutal punishment from Niketas. Niketas and his men had dragged him to the center of the mine, and the overseers, their hands covered in sweat, had beaten Cleon mercilessly, while the rest of the enslaved people were forced to watch. The sounds of the blows, crack, 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 had been deafening. Cleon's body had crumpled under the weight of each strike, his screams echoing in the narrow tunnels, reverberating off the cold stone walls. The others had been too afraid to intervene, their heads lowered in submission. Theodoros, however, had been unable to look away. He had wanted to scream, wanted to rush forward and tear the overseers apart with his bare hands, but the reality of his position held him back. There was no hope in resistance, no chance of survival if he acted. But inside him, something had shifted. The last of his patience had been spent, consumed by the sight of Cleon's battered body being dragged away. Theodoros had been broken, and in that moment, the spark of rebellion that had smoldered for so long suddenly ignited into an inferno of rage. That night, as he lay on the cold stone floor of his cramped quarters, Theodoros could not sleep. The images of Cleon's bloodied face, his final, strangled cries, haunted him. He could hear the sounds of the overseer's laughter, hear the mocking tone of Niketas's voice as they dragged the man away. Theodoros sat up, his back against the wall, breathing heavily in the dark. His thoughts whirled in his mind. He knew what he had to do. He had waited long enough, but there was no turning back now. If he was going to escape this hell, if he was going to make them pay for what they had done to him, to Cleon, and to all the others, he needed to strike now. He could feel the familiar weight of the pickaxe beside him. It had been his tool, his instrument of labor for so long. But tonight, it would be his weapon. Theodoros stood and moved quietly through the dark quarters. His comrades lay asleep, their breaths slow and steady, unaware of the storm that was about to break. He reached the small chest where he had hidden a few tools, scraps of metal, a rope, a small knife. These were the things he had collected over the years, small items no one would miss. He had been preparing for this day, though no one had known. He worked quickly, methodically. The plan was simple. He had memorized every twist and turn of the tunnels. He knew the overseer's routines by heart. Niketas would be at the head of the mine tonight, drinking, enjoying his power. The other overseers would be drunk, distracted. This was the moment Theodoros had been waiting for. Tonight, he would take back control. Tonight, he would make them pay. He took the knife and tucked it into his belt, then grabbed a rope. He knew the tunnels well enough to understand the layout, but the overseers didn't. There were secret shafts, forgotten areas that hadn't been used in years, places where the slaves worked in isolation, and those places would become their tombs. Theodoros stepped lightly through the halls, his footsteps soft but determined. He knew the danger, he knew the risk, but he also knew the price of inaction. He had watched enough of his fellow slaves die under the hands of these men. Cleon's death was the final blow. There would be no more, not if he could help it. As he reached the entrance to the mine, he paused. His eyes scanned the darkness, waiting for the right moment. The overseers were just ahead, gathered around a small fire, their laughter echoing through the tunnels. It was a sound Theodoros had learned to hate, a sound that spoke of their power over him and his people. He could feel the knife against his side, cold and steady. His hands were shaking, but it was not from fear. It was from the rush of power that came with knowing he was about to take the first step in changing everything. Niketas sat on a barrel, his back to Theodoros, unaware of the danger lurking behind him. Theodoros moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to hesitate. This was the moment. This was the time to strike. Without a sound, Theodoros stepped forward, his knife gleaming in the dim light. He was ready. He had prepared for this day for years. And now, it was time to make them all pay. The darkness of the tunnels seemed to grow thicker as Theodoros moved deeper into the mine. The dim glow of the lanterns flickered faintly ahead, casting long, jagged shadows across the rough stone walls. The air was damp and cool, but it carried the acrid scent of sweat and coal, the odor of a place where the living were buried beneath the earth, working to extract wealth they would never see. Niketas and the overseers had gathered around the fire, their voices rising in drunken laughter, their cruel jokes echoing off the stone walls. They had no idea what was about to happen, no idea that tonight would be the last time they would walk these tunnels. Their power over the slaves finally broken. Theodoros moved carefully, his footsteps light and measured. Every muscle in his body was taut, every sense alert to the slightest sound or movement. His heart pounded in his chest, but it was a steady rhythm, not one of fear, but of resolve. His plan was simple, and it would work if he was quick, if he was precise. The overseers would be isolated in their small group, too far from the others to be noticed. He had prepared the tunnels well, he had studied their every move. The time for patience was over. Theodoros paused just outside the flickering light of the overseer's campfire, his eyes scanning the scene. The overseers were drunk, their laughter echoing through the tunnels, unaware that their fate had already been sealed. Niketas was seated on a barrel, a bottle of wine in his hand. His voice slurred as he made another cruel remark. Theodoros's gaze fixed on him, the man who had tormented him and countless others for years. The hatred burned deep in his chest. But it was not the burning of fury, it was the cold, calculated fire of vengeance. He stepped forward, his steps swift and silent, the knife hidden beneath his tunic. His hands were steady, his breath controlled. He had learned long ago how to move unnoticed, how to become invisible to the overseers. It was a skill he had honed over years of enduring their cruelty, and now that skill would serve him in taking their lives. Nicetas had leaned forward, his back slightly turned, and Theodoros saw his chance. He moved quickly, silently, closing the distance between them in a matter of seconds. As he approached, he felt the weight of the knife in his hand, its cold steel, sharp and familiar. He was close now, so close that he could hear Nicetas's labored breathing, the scrape of his boots on the stone floor as he shifted. Theodoros tightened his grip on the hilt of the knife, his muscles coiled with anticipation. Without hesitation, he struck. The knife slid through the air, its sharp edge cutting through the darkness. It found its mark just below Nicetas's ribcage, the tip of the blade sinking deep into the overseer's flesh. Nicetas's eyes widened in shock as the cold steel pierced his body. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was lost in a ragged cough as blood bubbled from his lips. His hand grasped at his wound, his face contorting in pain, but it was too late. Theodoros was already gone, slipping back into the shadows before the overseer could make a sound. The rest of the overseers had been too drunk to notice the attack. They were too busy with their revelry, unaware that one of their own had just been killed. But that would not last long. Theodoros had planned it this way. He needed the chaos, the confusion. He needed the overseers to panic. And once the first one fell, the others would be left scrambling. Theodoros moved through the darkness like a shadow, his every step calculated, his mind focused on the next phase of his plan. He reached the next overseer, a man named Damianos, who was standing by the fire, watching the flames flicker. Theodoros knew him well. Damianos was the one who had beaten the slaves the most viciously, the one who took pleasure in inflicting pain. Damianos had a bottle in his hand, and he took a swig, laughing to himself as he swayed slightly. He was unaware of Theodoros's approach until it was too late. Theodoros stepped up behind him, quick as a serpent, and drove the knife into Damianos's side. The overseer's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening in a silent scream as he fell to the ground. His blood spilled across the floor, staining the stone beneath him. Theodoros didn't wait for the others to react. He moved again, his body fluid and quick, his every step precise. One more overseer remained, and he was standing near the farthest end of the firelight. Theodoros could see the figure clearly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he seemed to be lost in his own thoughts. This overseer, however, would not be taken down so easily. Theodoros hesitated for just a moment, weighing his options. He had no time to waste. The man had to die. There was no room for mercy. He had to act quickly, and he had to be sure. He sprinted forward, his feet light on the ground, and reached the overseer in seconds. The man turned just as Theodoros closed the distance, his eyes wide with shock. But it was too late. Theodoros's knife found its mark in the overseer's throat, and the man gasped for air, his hands clutching at the wound. Clara's plan had worked perfectly. In just moments, the overseers were dead. The air was thick with the scent of blood, and the silence that followed felt deafening. Theodoros stood over the bodies, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. There was no turning back now. The deed was done. The slaves, who had watched from the shadows, now emerged, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. They had seen Theodoros move through the darkness with the precision of a man who had been waiting for this moment for years. They had seen him bring justice to the overseers who had tormented them for so long, and now they stood in awe of him. Theodoros looked down at the bodies of the overseers, his expression unreadable. He had done what needed to be done, but the weight of it all felt heavy. The revenge he had sought had come to fruition. But what now? What would happen to the slaves of Laurion? They would be free. They would take control of the mine. But the world outside, the world beyond the tunnels, would not be so easily won. Theodoros took a deep breath and turned to the others. "We take the mine," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Tonight, we are free." Theodoros stood at the edge of the overseer's campfire, the shadows of their lifeless bodies sprawled around him like discarded tools. His chest still heaved with the adrenaline of the kill, but his mind had already shifted to the next step in his plan. The mine, once a place of endless toil and suffering, was now his to command. The slaves were free, and the overseers, the very ones who had wielded the whip and the lash, were no more. But the night was far from over. As Theodoros surveyed the small group of enslaved people emerging from the darkness, his thoughts became more focused. There would be no return to what had been. The act of rebellion, the swift strike that had ended the overseer's reign, was only the first chapter of this story. The true test of freedom would be what came next. The mine, the heart of Laurion's wealth, was now in the hands of those who had been its lifeblood for so long. But with this power came great responsibility. The other enslaved people gathered around him, their faces a mix of awe and confusion, their bodies stiff with the shock of what had just transpired. It was a sight Theodoros had imagined many times, his comrades standing beside him, ready to claim their freedom. But now, in the stillness of the night, it felt surreal. "Is it done?" asked Callias, his voice deep and quiet. Callias was a strong man, built like an ox, with hands calloused from years of work in the mines. His eyes flickered nervously to the overseers' bodies, and though he had always been a silent figure, there was a trace of something in his gaze, a glimmer of hope that had been buried deep inside him for so long. "It is," Theodoros replied, his voice steady, though his heart was heavy. He nodded toward the dead overseers. "They will never harm us again." Callias stood for a moment in silence, the weight of the words sinking in. He was a man who had seen his fair share of suffering. But this was different. The night had shifted everything, and with it, the fragile sense of safety they had clung to had been shattered. There would be no more overseers to rule over them. But the world outside the tunnels was a vast unknown, and the fight for true freedom had only just begun. Eleni, the youngest of the group, stepped forward. She was a slender woman, her face sharp with determination despite the softness in her features. She had been quiet throughout the night, her mind racing, but now her voice broke the silence. "What happens now? What do we do?" Theodoros looked at her, her wide, searching eyes filled with both fear and anticipation. She wasn't alone in her confusion. The others were just as uncertain. Theodoros's plan had been to take down the overseers, but he had never fully allowed himself to imagine what would happen once they were gone. He had focused so intently on the strike, on the act of rebellion itself, that he had neglected to consider what came after. Now, as the weight of responsibility fell upon him, he realized that the hardest part was still ahead. "We take the mine," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the tension in the air. "We work for ourselves now. We don't answer to anyone but ourselves. We're free." There was a murmur among the slaves as his words settled in. Some nodded, others still looked uncertain. But the idea of reclaiming the mine, of working for their own benefit, not for the greed of the plantation owners, had a certain allure. "The silver belongs to us," Theodoros continued. "We will extract it. We will use it to secure our freedom. There are those outside who will help us: abolitionists, sympathetic families, merchants. But we must first make sure the mine is ours. We take control, and we make sure that we are never enslaved again." Callias's gaze flickered, his hand still wrapped around his own pickaxe. "But how do we keep this? The authorities, the soldiers will come for us, won't they?" "Yes," Theodoros answered grimly. "They will come, and we will be ready." Theodoros moved to the overseers' bodies, and without hesitation, he dragged the nearest one by the arm. Niketas was heavy, his body lifeless, but Theodoros's hands were strong from years of manual labor. As he pulled the overseer into the darkness of the tunnel, a grim idea formed in his mind. If they were going to survive, if they were going to hold on to their newfound freedom, they had to send a message to those who would come after them. They couldn't afford to be weak. "Take them to the deepest part of the mine," he said, his voice cold. "We'll bury them where no one can find them. Let the earth swallow them. Let their memory die here with them. The others looked at him for a moment, stunned. But soon, they nodded in silent agreement. They worked together, carrying the bodies into the depths of the mine, the same tunnels where they had been enslaved for so long. They did not bury the overseers quickly. They made sure their bodies were hidden deep within the dark recesses of the labyrinth. It was an act of finality, an act of defiance against the men who had lorded over them for too long. Once the overseers were buried, Theodoros turned to the group. Tomorrow, we begin. We take control of this place, and we defend it. We will not be slaves any longer. As Theodoros finished speaking, a heavy silence settled over them. It wasn't joy. It wasn't celebration. It was the calm of knowing the battle had just begun. In the distance, the first rays of dawn began to break through the mine's narrow entrance, casting pale light on the faces of the newly freed slaves. The road to true freedom would be long and filled with danger. But for the first time in his life, Theodoros felt a flicker of something he had never known before: hope. Theodoros stood at the edge of the mine's shaft, staring into the dark expanse of the tunnels below. The sounds of the slaves working, the rhythmic pounding of pickaxes and the clatter of tools echoed through the stone, mixing with the distant calls of the men and women who had once been bound by the overseer's commands. Now, the air was different. There was a sense of autonomy, of ownership that Theodoros had never felt before. It was as if the very stone beneath his feet was his to command, his to shape. But even as he felt the weight of the mine in his hands, the shadow of danger loomed large. The overseers were dead, but the world outside Laurion had not changed. The authorities would come, and Theodoros knew they wouldn't stop until every one of them was dead or captured. In the days following the murder of the overseers, Theodoros and his small group of allies had begun to work the mine. They had seized the silver, stripping the tunnels bare of precious metals they could sell or trade for resources. They fortified their position, made plans to protect their new freedom. But each decision they made came with a heavy burden. They were no longer just slaves. They were fugitives, traitors in the eyes of those who controlled the land. That morning, as Theodoros surveyed the mine from its highest point, he could hear the distant murmur of voices. They had been working quickly, extracting as much silver as they could without drawing attention. But Theodoros knew the time would soon come when the authorities would notice the sudden loss of the mine's productivity. "Tomorrow, we make our move," Theodoros said to Callias, who stood beside him, his broad shoulders heavy with the weight of their shared responsibility. Callias nodded but said nothing. He had never been a man of many words. But Theodoros saw the unease in his eyes. It was the same unease that had settled into the hearts of everyone who had worked with him in the tunnels, the fear of what lay ahead, of the blood that would be spilled before this was over. "The soldiers will be coming for us," Theodoros continued, his voice low, his words steady. "They'll come with dogs, with weapons, with everything they've got. We need to be ready." Callias looked out over the mine, his gaze distant. "How do we fight back, Theo? We're just a few dozen. We have no weapons, no army." Theodoros turned to him, his eyes hardening. "We're not fighting an army, we're fighting for our lives. And I have a plan." Theodoros had spent the past few days thinking about their next move. He knew that their position was tenuous. They could not hold Laurion indefinitely. The authorities would come sooner or later, and if they were to survive, they had to make sure they had the upper hand. Theodoros's plan was simple but dangerous. They would send a message that the people of Laurion could not be beaten into submission any longer. His mind raced as he began to lay out the details. "We take the silver we've mined, all of it, and we make our way to the nearest port. We sell it, buy weapons, and send word to the abolitionists. Once we have the arms we need, we'll strike." Callias raised an eyebrow. "You want to take the silver and go into the cities? The authorities will be watching every road, every port." Theodoros smiled, though the expression was grim. "We'll be ready for them. We'll make sure no one follows us. We'll set traps, create diversions, do whatever it takes to make sure we can slip through unnoticed." "And if we fail?" Callias asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "If we fail, we fight until the last breath." "But we won't fail," Theodoros said, his tone unwavering. "The time for silence is over. We are free now, and we will make sure no one ever has the power to enslave us again." The days that followed were filled with preparation. Theodoros and his group worked tirelessly, extracting the silver from the tunnels and carefully packing it away. They moved in the shadows, avoiding any attention from the authorities, hiding in the caves during the day and emerging at night to continue their work. But the constant fear of being discovered gnawed at them. Every creak of the mine's wooden beams, every distant shout from the other slaves, made them jump. They had no choice but to trust in their plan. If they could get the silver out, if they could arm themselves, they would have a fighting chance. But every day, the risk of capture grew. One evening, as Theodoros sat near the entrance of the mine, staring out into the growing darkness, he felt the familiar weight of anxiety settle over him. His fingers brushed the worn edge of the knife he had hidden in his belt, a reminder of what had brought him here, a symbol of the blood he had spilled for freedom. The knife had once been a tool of survival, but now it was his weapon of war, a weapon that would allow him to strike down anyone who stood in the way of the new world he was trying to create. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Nico, the quick-witted and fearless member of their group, walking toward him. Nico's face was grim, and his usual smile was gone. He had been one of the first to join Theodoros in his plot against the overseers, and his loyalty was unquestioned. "We've got a problem," Nico said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" Theodoros asked, his heart sinking. He could already feel the tension in Nico's words. "The authorities. They're closer than we thought. We've had scouts watching the roads, and they've seen soldiers moving in. They're setting up camp not far from here." Theodoros's heart dropped. He had feared this moment. The authorities were already on their way. They had no time to waste. "Then, it's time," Theodoros said, standing up and turning to the others who were gathered around. "We move now. Tonight." The plan was set in motion. Theodoros and his group, armed with makeshift weapons and the silver they had extracted, began their trek through the dark tunnels of Laurion. The danger they faced was real, but Theodoros's resolve was stronger. They had survived this long. They could survive anything. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Theodoros would never allow the flames of rebellion to be snuffed out. Laurion would burn, and its overseers would be nothing but ash in the wind. The night was thick with the promise of storm. The air hung heavy with humidity, the kind that made the skin slick with sweat, the kind that seemed to thicken the very atmosphere until it was suffocating. But for Theodoros, there was no turning back. He had made his choice, and now, there was only forward. The time for waiting, for calculating, was over. The authorities were closing in, their boots heavy on the ground, their eyes keen with the scent of rebellion. As the small group of freed slaves moved through the dense forest surrounding Laurion's mine, every step felt like a test of their resolve. Theodoros led the way, his movements swift and purposeful, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead. He could feel the weight of the silver in the sacks strapped to their backs. It was a heavy burden, but it was also their key to survival. This was the silver that would buy them weapons, that would buy them protection, that would allow them to fight for the future they deserved. But with every step, the feeling of danger only grew. The night had never been so silent, the shadows never so thick. Theodoros's mind raced, his thoughts a blur of strategy and possibilities. The authorities would be coming for them, and he had no illusions about their intentions. They would stop at nothing to recapture them, to punish them for their defiance. "We can't be far now," Callias said, his voice low, almost drowned by the hum of the night. Theodoros could hear the weariness in his voice. Callias, the great ox of a man, had carried more than his fair share of the burden, but even his powerful frame was beginning to show signs of fatigue. "Not far," Theodoros replied, his tone firm. "We just have to make it to the coast. Once we're there, we'll find a way to get the silver to the abolitionists. But how do we know the authorities haven't already sealed the roads?" Nico asked, his eyes sharp in the darkness, his mind always thinking 2 steps ahead. "They've been watching. We're on borrowed time." Theodoros knew the risk. Every step they took felt like it could be their last, but they had no choice. The time to act was now, and if they waited any longer, they would lose their chance. Theodoros's mind kept flashing back to the moment when he had killed Niketas and Damianos, to the blood that had spilled in the tunnels beneath the mine. That had been his moment of rebellion, the moment he had chosen to take control of his life. Now, he had to make sure the rebellion would not die with the overseers. He pushed forward, his feet slipping on the wet ground as they made their way toward the coast. They had chosen a narrow path, one that they hoped would take them unnoticed. The plan was simple: slip past the authorities, make their way to the docks, and find a ship willing to take them to safety. But nothing ever went according to plan. Theodoros could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound of footsteps behind them made Theodoros's heart stop. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the sound of their own group, no. This was different. Theodoros's hand instinctively reached for the small blade tucked into his belt. "Get down," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. Callias, Nico, and the others dropped to the ground immediately, their bodies pressed low to the earth. Theodoros crouched, peering through the bushes, his eyes scanning the shadows. He could see nothing at first, but the sound of movement grew louder. They were being followed. A group of soldiers, their armor glinting faintly in the dim moonlight, appeared on the path ahead. They were too close. Theodoros's mind raced. If they were discovered now, it would be over. The soldiers would call for reinforcements, and the chase would be on. He had only moments to make a decision. He couldn't lead them to the coast. They would never make it in time. They would have to fight. Theodoros's mind snapped into action, and he motioned to the others. He pointed toward the trees, signaling for them to move. "Go." Now, Callias and Nico, understanding immediately, moved swiftly, their large forms vanishing into the shadows. Eleni, the youngest, hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with fear, but Theodoros grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "We have to keep moving," he urged, his voice urgent. They made their way through the underbrush, avoiding the soldiers' path. Every crack of a twig beneath their feet felt like an eternity. Theodoros's heart hammered in his chest, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He could hear the soldiers ahead, their voices growing louder as they searched for any sign of movement. But Theodoros knew they had to reach the coast. He couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Not after everything they had done. "Take the silver," Theodoros said, his voice low but commanding. "If we're caught, it's our last chance." He handed the sack of silver to Callias, who nodded silently, the weight of their survival resting on his strong shoulders. The group moved as one through the dark forest, the sound of the soldiers' pursuit growing nearer. It was a race against time. Minutes passed like hours. Theodoros could feel his breath growing more labored, his legs aching with the effort of running through the thick underbrush. He could see the faint glow of the coast ahead just a little farther, just a few more steps, and they would be there. Suddenly, a shout broke the silence. "There! They're ahead!" Theodoros's heart skipped a beat. The soldiers had found their trail. "Run!" Theodoros shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "Don't stop!" The final sprint to the coast felt like an eternity. Theodoros pushed his body harder, knowing that this was the moment of truth. They were so close to freedom, but with every step, the sound of the soldiers' pursuit grew louder. And then, just as they broke through the final line of trees, Theodoros saw the glint of the water. The docks were just ahead. They had made it, but the soldiers were close. Too close. With no time to waste, Theodoros turned to Callias and Nico. "Get to the boats. Go!" And with that, Theodoros turned and faced the incoming soldiers, his heart steady, his mind clear. He wasn't going to let them take him back. Not now. Theodoros's fingers tightened around the knife, the steel cold against his skin. He would fight, and if he fell, he would do so standing,